And what we're going to do for the next part of today is discuss self-work. And for us, this was a really interesting and exciting uh, turn in kind of thinking about these forms of work and these kinds of objects when we started to think about how to group them in some way. And the initial aim for the book was really quite modest. I mean, you might say it still is, but it was quite modest in the sense of it was meant to really just kind of categorize and organize these different forms of work and give people a resource that were interested in maybe the intersection or even understanding what kinds of work exist and where they were. And so we just started to think about, well, how would we group these things into ways that made sense, where there are common threads to them. And some of them were relatively easy. And so the ones in the self work were to some extent easy and some extent not. And so if you take identity, for instance, we talk about identity work as a form of self work, but it's obviously also a form of organizational work. And you could have identities associated with all kinds of different constellations of actors. And so we simplify by talking it in relationship to the self. And that's true across a number of the categories that we put into these overarching themes around self and organization and institutional work. So, for instance, boundary work, similarly, you could imagine very easily sitting into a form of self work, into a form of organization work, or a form of institutional work. Where we got to, though, in kind of pushing this direction was helpful because it led us to think a little bit more systematically about the nature of the objects themselves and what we were talking about. And when we started to think about the nature of the self and people's work on the self, we started to think both about the ways in which academic discourse has changed over the last 30, 40 years, and also the way in which the self in non-academic um, life has changed, and not just over the last 40 years, but over a much longer period of time. Because one of the things that really um, became obvious to us when we were looking at the research on this and the writing, both within management and much more broadly, was that these objects that people work on need to be available as objects that are malleable and shapeable, identifiable, understandable as socially constructed in some way before anyone could engage in purposeful action or reflexive action that was meant to shape it in some way, which is really where what led us to move toward um, thinking about what are the histories or kind of archaeologies, if you like, of these different objects, particularly in relationship to the kinds of work that people do on them. And so we start with the self, and we think it's a really useful starting point for bringing in this dynamic understanding of objects and consequently a kind of dynamic understanding of the work that people do. And there were some questions in the chat in the first half of today around things like virtuality and the pandemic and so on. And one thing we are not trying to do is kind of anchor or stop this conversation, because if you believe that these social systems change and the assumptions about objects change, that will continue to unfold over the future as well as the past. And so things like virtuality may indeed shape how we think of the self, the boundaries of it, what's malleable, what's not, and so on. But let's go back a little ways first and talk about the history of the self and what has led to it being a social symbolic object in the way we recognize it now. If we look at two significant turns in social history, and here we're really talking about Western social history because that's the history we know, and that's the history we write about in the book. We look at Western history, and we look at two significant turns that were really broad societal turns: the turn toward modernity and the turn toward postmodernity as being critical in shaping not just the self, but all of the social symbolic objects that we're going to talk about. Prior to modernity in the West, the conception of a person was really uh, closely aligned and almost synonymous with their role in society. And so, for the understanding of work on the self was the fulfillment of a role. And you were mostly born into those roles. There was some movement, obviously, um, but primarily it was a relatively static set of roles and a relatively static alignment or fulfillment of those roles. And that was as close as we got to doing self work in that period. The advent of modernity changed things. Um, it led to the conception of the self. And when we talk about modernity, we mean a period, and you can kind of anchor it around early 17th or mid 17th century, if you like. But and depending on where you go and what you're talking about, it's a long transition. But the transition that happened in terms of the self was the movement from uh, accepting an exterior definition of a role toward the self itself becoming a reflexive project that one would work on. And so multiple discourses became available that one would sort of choose, in quotes, choose between, or these become available to you. And the second really significant change was the interiorization. So if you think about the self as a set of behaviors and routines, what happened with modernity was the self became something inside the body as opposed to outside the body, in the mind rather than outside the mind. And so what that meant was that um, instead of behaviors and routines, it became a matter of um, thoughts, feelings, reflections, decisions, beliefs about oneself became the self. This was really kind of most kind of famously captured in Descartes' saying around "I am, I think, therefore I am," which isn't exactly what he said, but it's close enough for our purposes. With the point being that the mind and the body became separate, such that the mind became associated with the self rather than the body. And what that meant was that there was a lot of work suddenly done, and you saw this in popular culture with the advent of things like the novel, but especially things like diaries. And so, if we think about diaries now in contemporary times, we think of diaries as something where we put our um, private personal thoughts. Diaries, when they first emerged, were really a tool to work toward becoming a more authentic self and particularly a more pious self. And so when we look at early diaries, they're often full of kind of verbal self flagellation for not living up to the expectations of the day, and not necessarily behavioral expectations, but behavior, expectations in terms of one's beliefs, one's thoughts, one's attitudes, one's emotions. And so these diaries we see of that time were people trying to work toward a more self-disciplined, and this is where Foucault comes in, a more disciplined, self-controlled understanding of the self. And it's also where authenticity came in. And so authenticity doesn't make a lot of sense if you're thinking about the self as committed to the fulfillment of a social role. Authenticity makes sense when we imagine that the self is bounded to the person and the individual mind. And so we can develop our authentic selves as idiosyncratic to ourselves. And then the 20th century comes along, lots of stuff happens. And sometime around the middle of this 20th century, you can call it post World War II, particularly in the 1960s and early 1970s. But in that sort of 30-year period, there was an advent of postmodernity. And postmodernity was occasioned significantly by technological change, but also by social change. And what happened to the self in that period was a movement from authenticity in the sense of a single um, autonomous self that you were working to fulfill to a whole network of selves, kind of from instead of one eye and lots of me's, you got lots of eyes, to use the kind of median terminology. Two important things for us happened at in this period. One is that uh, there was a move away from there was a retainment of change, and so modernity was about change, modernity was about progress. Progress in terms of the self was the move toward an authentic self. Postmodernity retains the emphasis on change, and significantly abandons or at least loosens the idea of progress, at least toward an individual kind of grand narrative sense of progress, like authenticity might suggest. Instead, it suggests a kind of plurality of possible positive directions for the evolution of the self, both across selves and even within the self. So the self becomes plural and evolving in multiple ways simultaneously. At the same time, it becomes quite locally rooted, so that now the self is not about less about authenticity than it is about local progress and local politics. And so when we think about the ways in which the self is adjudicated today, we have lots of local conceptions of what it means for a self to emerge or to evolve. Um, there's a piece here which is interesting where there's a question, and obviously even a social symbolic work perspective kind of depends and significantly on this postmodern turn. Depends on the idea of things being socially constructed and available for people to work on without necessarily there being some transcendental endpoint like authenticity to work toward. So that could mean that anything goes. And so, Nelson and I have over, decades now had conversations with friends who are not interested in social construction, who associate it with the idea, well, if the world is socially constructed, that means just kind of anything goes. And that's not the point. The point is not that anything goes, and the point is not that there's no truth. The point is that there are multiple truths that are locally grounded um, in local conditions. And this really comes out now. If we think about the changes that have occurred in the self, so if you think about gender, for instance, and the discourse around gender and the possible transformations that we now either take for granted or grudgingly accept, depending on who you are, around gender and the possible fluidity of gender, the possible kind of articulation of numbers of different kinds of genders, and so on. Those are really kind of fluid and active and a vibrant sort of conversation going on right now. And so one of the things we didn't do, but we could have done and maybe should have done, was ask you to put, for instance, your pronouns into Zoom. So you've probably been on Zoom meetings where we put our pronouns. That just wasn't the case even probably 7 or 8 years ago. And so now that's very different. What we don't do is we don't ask you to put your race on a Zoom call and identify yourself in that way. And because the discussion and the discourse around race is very different than the discourse around gender. And Rachel Dolezal is a very famous person as an instance of the limits of postmodernity and the self. And conversations around it. And so if you don't know the story of Rachel Dolezal, she was a college instructor. She was the former National Association for the Advancement of Colored People president of a local chapter. She became famous, beyond those roles, or even really in part because of those roles, when her parents were interviewed and publicly stated that she was a white person passing as Black. This created all kinds of problems. If you don't know the Dolezal story, this created all kinds of problems for Rachel Dolezal. She was reported to the police. The local news media picked it up. And she was described in the local news media both as someone who had falsely passed as Black and also been the victim of race-related hate crimes. Her life became, in some ways, really quite nightmarish. Whether you have sympathy for her or not is another issue. She resigned from the NAACP. She was dismissed from her position as an instructor in African Studies at Eastern Washington University. When she was interviewed in 2015, she said she was born white to white parents, in quotes, but self-identified as Black. This created all kinds of reactions from many communities because there was very strong reactions from some Black communities who accused her of really gross kinds of mistreatment of both Black people and the concept of being a Black person. She was also uh, attacked, maybe is too strong a word, but certainly strongly criticized by transgender groups because there was arguments being made, not really by her, but on her behalf, that there was a kind of equivalence to passing as Black and choosing, or at least identifying as a trans woman or a trans man or um, uh, uh, the question became, are those similar? Are those different? Are those equivalent? Are those not equivalent? From the perspective of one of the interviews in The Guardian, for instance, and I'll get this wrong, I'm sure the quotation, so forgive me if that's the case, but um, the argument from some transgender activists was that transgender people don't choose a gender, they are born into that gender, and then they come out as that gender. For instance, you come out as a trans man or a trans woman, but being very different than passing as or identifying as Black. So the point here is, I mean, we're not interested in either criticizing or celebrating Rachel Dolezal at all. What we're interested in is the example of this person and their activity showing both the potential and the limitations of self-work at this point in time, at this point in history, in this particular social system. We're going to come back to that as an example and give you a chance to kind of look at that issue around race and self-work in a minute. But first, I want to kind of finish off some of the more conceptual part of this conversation. One of the most systematic parts of the literature on self-work is a tendency to identify self-work as something done by a person on themselves. And this isn't universal by any stretch, but there is a tendency for us to think of identity work as something we do, as emotion work, as the control we express over our own emotions. So um, Ken Gergen, for instance, writes about doing anger. And so we think about doing anger as a form of emotion work, at least to the extent that we do it purposefully and reflexively and so on. But one of the important things we like to point out and want to point out in this relationship of agents to self-work is the idea that focal actors do this work, but so are a whole other set of actors involved, for instance, in self-work, such as emotion work. There are connected individuals, so friends, family, bosses, subordinates, peers will do self-work in relationship to each other. Organizations do self-work, so you can think of socialization, for instance, as a classic kind of self-work done by organizations. And you can imagine, particularly with more extreme forms of socialization, if you think of a military situation or a quasi-military organization and the kinds of socialization that goes on. But you can also imagine for the doctoral students, you probably have a doctoral supervisor. One of the things they're trying to do is turn you into a proper academic. You enter it either an improper academic or unlikely not an academic at all. And one of their jobs is not only to kind of help you learn the business, but help you to become this. And so if you're familiar with the communities of practice literature, for instance, becoming a plumber is learning to be a plumber, not just learning to do plumber work. And the same for academics and their organizations. And then social systems also do much broader, more broadly, they do self-work. So if you think about communities, and if you think about, for instance, religious communities, then those religious communities do lots of work to help instill appropriate values, beliefs, behaviors, but also dress, relationships, uh, such that the members of those religious communities become appropriate and proper selves. And I pick on religious communities only because they provide a kind of more obvious example of that. Obviously, lots and lots of different kind of communities do that same work. Just a couple of examples. We've talked about emotion work already. I'm going to skip over that. Um, One of the, I think, really interesting possible kinds of work that people have not looked at very much, which is really ironic in a way, given that we work in business schools, most of us, is the idea of career work. And there was a couple of you who identified that as primarily interested in career work, which is fantastic. I think careers as social symbolic objects are a really profoundly important an understudied phenomena from this perspective. The literature on careers has really predominantly looked at careers as simple histories of the evolution of a person's jobs, work, and so on. And what it's not tended to look at is how people construct the career as an object itself. And if you think about again, if you think about academic life, we do a lot of work constructing not only the steps and stages of our career, getting a job, etc., but making sense of, telling the story of our careers, trying to understand our careers in terms of who we are. Uh, and this becomes especially important. A number of you made comments in the chat around things like the gig economy, side hustles, boundaryless careers. This is where people do even more, or at least more obvious forms of career work. If you think of it, conceptualizing it as self work, so what? What does that mean? Well, one of the things it does is embed careers in a much broader network of social symbolic objects and social symbolic work than you might normally think of it as embedded in. So, for instance, you would embed career work in relationship to families, organizations, technologies. You would embed it in relationship to emotions and identities. All of these different objects would be kind of in play, motivating, but also informing and shaping the career work you might do.